Welcome to episode 114 of Anchored in Education. I'm E. Scott England, and Anchored in Education is the podcast dedicated to all things education. Educators across the world routinely engage in conversations surrounding fundamentals, concepts, and new ideas that improve this great profession. Sometimes we agree, other times we disagree. But at the end of the day, we are all anchored in education. Just a few days from today will mark the 7th anniversary of the fatal shooting of Philando Castile in the Minneapolis-St. Paul metropolitan area. A couple of months ago marked the 3-year anniversary of the murder of George Floyd, also in the Minneapolis-St. Paul metropolitan area. Located just miles from both of these tragic incidents was our guest today, David Mura. David is a third-generation Japanese American. Both his grandparents and parents spent time in a Japanese internment camp during World War II. Already an accomplished author, David recently published his newest book, The Stories Whiteness Tells Itself: Racial Myths and Our American Narratives. This book explores how white stories about race attempt to erase the brutality of the past and underpin systemic racism in the present. This book takes an in-depth look at how historical and fictional narratives have been told to justify and maintain white supremacy. It is a book that can, at times, feel like a gut check to readers, but it is one that I feel we need to explore more on Anchored in Education. David, welcome to Anchored in Education today.
Thank you for having me.
Well, very excited to have you, very excited to talk about this book that you have written, and I'm going to get to that in just a second. But first, before we get started today, we'd like to find out a little bit more about you and how you became anchored in education.
Well, I have served as a creative writing teacher in both college and MFA programs. And for many years, I've addressed in my teaching the issues of race and diversity. And I introduced in the MFA program I was teaching in a specific course for writers on writing about race. And that eventually led to a book I did on creative writing on race, The Stranger's Journey, Race, Identity, and Narrative Craft in Writing. But I also have worked with my friend Alex Pate, who's a novelist, a scholar, and an educator. And he designed a program called The Innocent Classroom.
Yes.
This program is designed to help train K through 12 teachers to improve their relationships with students of color. And I served as the first trainer other than Alex in the program, and for a couple of years I served as director of training. So I became very intimately involved with that project, which now is working in schools all over the country and has shown significant results in terms of behavior and academic performance of students of color.
Yeah, and I think we're even going to dive into that a little bit more as we go on today. But before we get to that, we're talking today about your book, The Stories Whiteness Tells Itself: Racial Myths and Our American Narrative. Now, to me, this is a powerful book. It sheds light on the persistent trauma, racism that continues in our country. And so 2 high-profile incidents, Philando Castile and George Floyd, happened just miles from your house. Can we start today's conversation talking about where the idea and motivation to pursue this project came from?
Well, I had been writing some essays on race. For instance, I have an essay on Black Lives Matter, which predated my start on this book. But once Philando Castile was killed, and it happened so close to my house on this road I drive by very often because it's really not a high traffic area.
Sure.
It's an area which is lined by a golf course, and the fields for the University of Minnesota's agricultural program. and it's only known as a speed trap. And I knew people who knew Philando Castile, and in the Twin Cities, it's very small. You either know somebody or know somebody who knows somebody.
Right.
And I began writing about this, and I began to see how often in conservative accounts of it, he was considered guilty, no matter the fact that he wasn't guilty of any crime.
Right.
And the extent to which conservative media outlets tried to justify what had happened to him. And he had been stopped more than 50 times in 10 years.
Right.
And his mother says it was 80 times. Now, if I address white audiences and I ask them how many times you've been stopped in the last 10 years by the police, by the time I get to 20, there's no hands up, right? I mean, Tim Scott, the senator from South Carolina, said that in 1 year he was stopped 8 times simply because he was driving a new car, and he's a senator, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I realized as I was writing about this that you couldn't understand what happened on Larpenteur Road in this near suburb of St. Paul without understanding its roots in American history, without understanding the way we tell narratives about police encounters from both a white official viewpoint and a black viewpoint, without understanding the ways that blackness was criminalized in the 19th century through what happened during Reconstruction, through pseudo-social science studies which took like any instance of a black crime as absolute evidence of black criminality, where the same studies would talk about white individuals committing crime, and it cast no stain on white people, and was explained by these were just individuals who often stole or committed a crime because of socioeconomic circumstances, right?
Right.
And so the idea that Philando Castile had, that he was, in certain ways, I think, always understanding that he was in danger from the police, that he was being hunted. And this is an experience that many Black Americans have, and that white Americans still don't really understand how Black Americans live with this every day. And then when Philando, and I completed almost most of the book, at least the first draft, and then George Floyd was murdered, again in an area not far from my house, very close to me. My son, who works in the high schools, knew Darnella Frazier, who took the video of it. Mm-hmm. He knew the fire department EMT who tried to intervene, right? So all of this was very close to me in terms of our community. And the demonstrations that took place around the 3rd Precinct took place 3 blocks from my daughter's house, 4 blocks from where she worked. It is something that all of us in the Twin Cities felt very viscerally.
Oh, I can only imagine. Now, when you started this book, you started by discussing how your parents, now they were just teenagers, and they were sent to Japanese internment camps along with their parents during World War II. You go on talking of how you wanted to grow up being thought of actually as white, and you even said that at one point a friend of yours said, you know, that they just viewed you as another white person, and you felt like that was a victory because that's what you were trying during that period. So I'm sure you are far from the only person to have grown up feeling this way. I'm wondering if we could spend a few minutes discussing these thoughts and the implications they have on a person, as well as how your identity now shapes your writing.
Yes. Well, my parents, along with 120,000 Japanese Americans, were imprisoned by the United States government in desolate areas of the West, South, and Southwest, behind barbed wire fences with rifle towers facing inwards. My parents were born in the United States. They were natural-born citizens. 2/3 of the people that were imprisoned were natural-born citizens. And at the time, it was this idea that the Japanese were a threat, a fifth column potential site of activity. But they did not do this to the German Americans. We were fighting Germany.
Right.
They did not do that to the Italian Americans. We were fighting the Italians. right? They rounded up a few of the people from the German and Italian American population, but not the entire population. And I think my parents got the message that they were 11 and 15. They had never done anything, and no Japanese American was ever convicted of any espionage.
Right.
So their crime was their race and ethnicity. And I think after they got out, and they felt like they should assimilate into a white middle class identity, lose any sort of trappings of Japanese culture, and raise their children to become like middle class white Americans. And I didn't begin to question. I went through 5 years of English graduate school. I read through the whole Anglo-American canon at that time, which was entirely white.
Mm-hmm.
And it was only after I left graduate school and began reading Black authors that I finally realized, oh, I'm not white. I'm never going to be white.
Right.
Who the hell am I? And what does it mean to be a Japanese American? And I had never understood, because my parents had never talked about the internment camps, the effect of that on them. Now, ironically, in the 1980s, a legal researcher, Peter Irons, discovered that the military had determined that the Japanese Americans were not a military threat, but they lied to the public about it. And the Solicitor General, when he argued the 4 cases of the protesting the internment in the Supreme Court, failed to mention, and essentially then lied, about this military study. And that led to an overturning of the famed Korematsu case. It led to Congress and President Ronald Reagan apologizing to the Japanese American community and admitting there was no military necessity for the camps, and that the real reason was race prejudice, wartime hysteria, and a failure of leadership. Now, when Donald Trump was running for president, somebody asked him about the internment camps. Right. And he said, I don't know, you would have had to been there, implying that there was dangers there that we're not aware of, which means he was unaware of the fact that Congress and President Reagan, the Republican hero, had apologized to our community, had admitted there was no military necessity for the camps. And instead, members of the administration used the camps as justification and precedent for the Muslim ban and for other anti-Arab and Islamic American measures, right? So this is again an illustration of the fact that we as Americans often don't know our own history.
Sure.
Now, as a sidelight I want to just mention about this is that at the beginning of the war, the military understood, like, we have white Americans who speak German. We have white Americans who speak Italian. We don't have any white Americans who speak Japanese. So they had to go into the internment camps where Japanese Americans were in prison and recruit people who spoke Japanese. Now, they were trained here in Minnesota, and I've actually done a documentary about these men and some 100 women. And they went on to the Pacific to serve as battlefield guides, interrogators of prisoners, translators of captured documents and messages. And General MacArthur's chief of intelligence, General Willoughby, said that these MIS, these military intelligence service Japanese Americans, shortened the war in the Pacific by 2 years and saved 1 million American lives.
Wow.
People still don't know the story of what these men did. And so which I tell audiences, which means there are anti-immigrant, anti-Asian Americans alive today because of the work of these Japanese Americans who helped save their fathers and grandfathers. Sure. And this is the value of diversity. This is the value of immigration, which so many people fear.
Now, I'm guessing the reason that you started the book with that story on the internment camps, because like you said, the Japanese Americans that ended up in internment camps ended up in there simply because they existed as a Japanese American. And it ties right into what you were talking about with Philando Castile, and that he was pulled over more than 50 times, more than 80, from his mother says, but we know more than 50. simply because of the color of his skin on a lot. And so I'm guessing that you did that to show the ties of how we still have these same racial profiling problems happening in America today. Is that what the connection was?
That's definitely a reason why I did this. But I also did it because I'm speaking here about the white version of history. I'm speaking about how white people think about their identity, right? Mm-hmm. And what my story tells people is I studied what it was like to be white. I believed in the myths of pure, unsullied American heroes. You know, I identified with General George Custer against the Sioux in fighting the Native Americans. I identified with Abraham Lincoln. I identified with Jefferson. I identified with Washington, right? And I read books and biographies about them. And I got the version of American history that many people of my generation got. And I know that when I was growing up, we didn't talk about the internment camps in school. My daughter grew up, and they didn't talk about the internment camps in school. My daughter is now a Minnesota legislator, and she sponsored an ethics studies course because she said, you know, I want my son and my grandson to grow up in education learning about this history.
Let's talk about racial history a little bit, because I do believe problems within our society when it comes to defining racism is in part due to ways white America wants to and does tell our racial history, to the exclusion of the consciousness, experiences, and narratives of blacks and other people of color. Racism, as defined by a majority of white people, would consist only of conscious acts of hate and discrimination, which must be accompanied by states of racist intent. I'm wondering if we could take maybe that definition and contrast it with a definition which understands racism and the ideology of whiteness as a system of ideas, beliefs, rules, and practices, and how racial bias can be conscious and explicit, but also unconscious and implicit. And there's a lot there to unpack, but I'm hoping we can unpack that a little bit.
You know, in my book, I define whiteness as an ideology, as a set of beliefs, ideas, rules, and practices, which govern the way white people think about themselves, which govern how they act in the world. Now, this ideology is not inherent genetically to white people. People learn it. And you find that kids who haven't, the younger you get, the less racist kids get, because they have to learn this.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
And we think of racism as very simple, and it's defined very simple. It's like somebody acts with an act of discrimination or hatred towards others and does this with conscious intent and says openly, I'm doing this because I'm racist. Now, no one in America admits to this.
Right.
So you've constructed a definition where racism does not exist. Now, who constructs this definition? It's not people of color.
Right.
It's white people who believe this definition, who have constructed this So already you set the terms of the debate. And as any lawyer knows, if you set the terms of the argument of the issue, you've already won. But the question is, why should we as people of color assent to this definition? First of all, we know that there is explicit racism, where people are consciously hold racist beliefs and commit and act with racial bias. But we also know that everybody understands, even though I do this, I should never admit it, right? Mm-hmm. And the great historian of Reconstruction, David Blight, has said, hypocrisy is a tool of racism. So one can act with racist intent, but if you never pronounce the fact that you're doing so, then you're not a racist. Now, there's also implicit or unconscious racism, where people can fervently believe in equality, but react in ways which show racial bias. There's a famous Harvard psychological test where people are, for instance, are shown pictures of children with objects in their hand. And most white people are more likely to see an object in a black child's hand as a gun when it's not than a white child's hand. And I first learned about this test from Malcolm Gladwell, the New Yorker writer, who said, even I showed implicit unconscious bias, and my mother's black.
Yeah.
I'm black.
Yeah.
Right? Because you're taught the way to see people through racial stereotypes. Now, but beyond this, you have to look at that definition because, for instance, there's this famous case, a Supreme Court case, McCleskey, and it was about the death penalty in Georgia. And if you're a black person who killed a white person, you were likely to receive the death penalty 70% of the time. If you're a white person who killed a black person, you were likely to receive the death penalty at 20% of the time.
Wow.
So there's this 50% discrepancy in the way the death penalty is applied racially. Now, the Supreme Court ruled that this was still constitutional and was not evidence of racial bias. They would only accept if the prosecutors themselves said, yeah, we're racially biased, and this 70% is for if you're a white person, if black person killing a white person, you get the death penalty, and 20% if you're a white person killing a black person, you get the death penalty. This statistical discrepancy is not enough to prove racism. We need an open declaration. And the Supreme Court then said, and if we accepted just the statistical difference, we would have to question the whole justice system. We would have to question whether there's racial bias in the whole justice system, and we're not going to do that, right? And so, there's been a lot of controversy lately about woke, and most people can't define it. Now, the DeSantis administration has actually defined it, and they defined it. One aspect of being woke is that there is a systemic injustice in the United States. So when they're saying they're anti-woke, we can't even address the question of whether there's systemic justice in the United States, whether this is systemic racism. So that's how whiteness manifests itself. It sets the rules for the debate. It sets the rules for what we will consider racism. And none of these rules are rules which people of color would assent to. Because, as I've said, they essentially make racism impossible to prove.
Sure. Now, do you think, and this is clearly looking at it through my educator lens, but looking at several court cases in the past, let's just say, we'll say 20 years, but it's probably more in the last, say, 10, that when it comes to the freedom of expression and speech, that we have begun really, I guess, ruling in favor of schools when they ban, say, symbols of hate like the Confederate flag. And we're also seeing that in a lot of our sporting events where, it's not allowed to be flown because these are symbols of hate and everything else. I mean, long way to go, but do you feel at least we're trying to move in the right direction, or is it more of a one step forward, two steps back on then all the other policy that goes against us?
Well, I think there's a majority of people of color in America who want to move towards equality and democracy. Within the white population, there is a portion of the population who does want to move towards equality and democracy and who recognizes that there's systemic racism in America. But there's a portion of the white population who actually believes that they are more discriminated against than people of color, who are fearful of the fact, which Obama's election brought home to them, that our demographics are changing. And after 2040, we will no longer have a white majority in this country. We will all be racial minorities. And a portion of the white population is absolutely freaked out by this. And they don't see it as a good thing. And this portion has become increasingly anti-democratic. because they recognize they will no longer have a racial majority in this country. So, and you see the manifestation in this, for instance, in education, in the attempt to ban books. I mean, they want to ban Moms for Liberty, this conservative parental organization, wants to ban the story of Ruby Bridges. Now, Ruby Bridges was a 6-year-old black girl who in 1960 desegregated the New Orleans school.
Right.
And she had to pass through crowds of adult white people shouting insults with signs, spitting to get to school. Now, Moms for Liberty says, oh, this will hurt our white children. This will make us feel bad. Now, my children are half Japanese American and half white American. They read the books. They didn't feel bad. They felt
right.
angry.
Yeah.
They felt inspired by the courage of Ruby Bridges. They felt inspired to fight for social justice. So what these Moms for Liberty are saying is, two things. Either we don't believe our children can be inspired by Ruby Bridges, or we don't want our children to be inspired by Ruby Bridges.
And I feel, unfortunately, it's more of that.
And the second thing is, if they were so concerned about the fragility of children, they would also be protesting the fact that every black parent in America must tell their children stories of police brutality and police murder in order to prepare them for what happens if they are stopped with police.
Sure.
But of course, Moms for Liberty are not concerned with the fact that black parents have to tell their children these narratives, these stories. They're not concerned with the fragility of black children.
Now, David, I'm sure that there is a better way to say this, but your book gets real with readers. Some would say it's not sugar-coated. I know that's how I felt reading it, but I think that it is important in highlighting how systemic racism has not only been a practice in America, but it is still ongoing, like we're talking about right here with Moms of Liberty. So, what suggestions do you have for readers in overcoming psychological denial and engaging more deeply with the struggle for racial equality?
Let me answer this in two parts.
Sure.
One, I want to talk about Jefferson, right? Because we're talking about how we teach history, right? And learning about history. And so if I talk to you about Jefferson and say he was our third president, he wrote the Declaration of Independence, he helped write the Constitution, he was an inventor, he was an architect, he was a brilliant man. Our country owes a lot to his existence, to Jefferson. You would say great. But then if I said he owned 600 people as slaves during his lifetime, he impregnated a 16-year-old girl who had no rights of refusal to any sexual advance that he made to that girl, Sally Hemings.
Mm-hmm.
Their children, Sally Hemings was 1/4 black. Their children were 1/8 black. People would say to him, Tom sure looks like you, these kids.
Mm-hmm.
He kept them as slaves. He kept the mother of his children as a slave even after he died. Now, if somebody was doing that down the street, you would think, that's a monster. We need to report him to the police. So the thing is, if we lower the moral bar in the past, it makes it easier to lower the moral bar in the present. If we don't understand the racism of the past, we don't understand how the racism of the past created the racism of the present, right? And and this is simply the truth of our history that we have to wrestle with. And if we don't wrestle with it, we're going to be in constant denial. And that is part of white identity. So in my book, I talk about this sort of psychological spiritual journey that white people need to undergo. And I liken it to the process outlined by Helen Kubler-Ross in her book on death and dying. And she says there are 5 stages in people's acceptance of their own mortality. First, there is denial. Then there is bargaining. No, then denial, anger, bargaining, grief, and acceptance.
Mm-hmm.
The great African American author James Baldwin says, identity is a question inducing the most profound panic, a terror as primary as the nightmare of the mortal fall. So what Baldwin is saying is that to consider changing one's identity is almost as frightening as confronting the fact that you're going to die. Now, when we're dealing with race, the first response is denial. There is no racism. There is no racism in America. In fact, white people are more discriminated against than people of color. Then there's anger. Why are you bringing this up? We had a perfectly fine church. We had a perfectly fine school. We had a perfectly fine business. We had a perfectly fine community until you started bringing up these specious charges of racism. And the problem is not racism. The problem is you. Then it becomes bargaining. Okay, racism exists, but it's just a few bad apples, right?
Yeah,
And
it's everyone else. It's not me. Sure.
Chris Rockman said, would you want to fly in an airline that had a few bad apples for pilots?
Right.
Would you want to be operated on a surgery department that has a few bad apples for surgeons?
Right, yeah.
Of course not. But the thing is, everywhere you see these vast statistics of racial disparities. Black unemployment, it's always been twice that of white unemployment. Black and white Americans use marijuana at exactly the same rate. But blacks are 3.64 times more likely to be arrested for using marijuana. And after they're arrested, they're more likely to go to trial. And at trial, they're more likely to be convicted, they're more likely to be sentenced, and they're more likely to be sentenced to longer terms of imprisonment. Well, that isn't just a result of a few bad apples.
Right.
It's systemic at every stage of the justice system, those racial inequalities. And you can't explain them by just a few bad apples. It has to do with unconscious and implicit racial bias. It has to do with the way laws are interpreted. It has to do with practices of the police department, how things are tried, both the personal views of judges and lawyers, but also the rules of how things are argued, as in the McCleskey case, which says which essentially said, unless people openly declare racist intent, there is no racism, right? So you can act with racist intent all you want, but just as long as you go, well, I did it for another reason. I did it for states' rights. I did it for privacy. I did it because that's where the crime is, right? So this bargaining then leads to, if you get past that, you feel grief and you feel sad. And you may feel sad for people of color and how they've suffered. You may feel sad for yourself, your image of America. You may start going, am I a good person? And one of the things I want to say to people is I don't start talking about race in order to shame and guilt people.
Right.
I don't believe you change people through shame and guilt. You change them through knowledge and love. Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement showed us that. And so I'm not saying all this so that you would go around as a white person and go, am I a bad person? That's really not the question.
Right.
The question is there systemic racism in this society? And what are we going to do about it? And if you get past grief, then you come to acceptance. And what happens when white people begin to accept the existence of systemic racism is they stop spending all this energy trying to reject the evidence that this systemic racism exists. They stop trying to push away the presence of people of color who are threatening to their identity. And it's not only that they reach a state of psychological calm and spiritual peace, but they begin to understand that this is the greatness of America. Our diversity is our greatness. Those Japanese American linguists who helped America in World War II are just one example of that greatness. The survival of Black Americans in our country is another example of the greatness. They've acted as the moral conscience when it comes to race of our nation, and we are better for it.
Yeah. And, the thing is, if we would stop there, where you just talked about the different stages ending with acceptance, in which, then we can begin, this collaborative work towards that equality and everything else. But we're not to the acceptance. In fact, you mentioned your daughter being a legislator in Minnesota. And so it seems like, and this isn't in Minnesota, and I'm not going to mention states, but it seems like we're a constant step backwards, because instead of that acceptance, instead of working through that, we have policymakers that are continuing to attempts to restrict curriculum in schools. So we frequently hear of new legislation being passed banning CRT, the critical race theory, Black history, African American studies, and so on. So how could America be different if schools put greater emphasis on stories and experiences of all Americans, rather than just the white-dominated narratives like you had given us with Jefferson? Because I can tell you that, growing up in a predominantly white community, in learning about Jefferson, I heard about the first piece of Jefferson, the third president, the architect, all of these things. It wasn't until then I grew up and sought out that knowledge. Like you said, it's not about shaming, it's about acquiring knowledge to find out there's another side. So what can schools do to help this? Because the adults aren't getting it done right now.
No, we have to teach these histories. We have to teach a diversity of stories, whether we're talking about history, and history has different perspectives. Somebody once said history is a tale of the victors, but it should not be just the tale of the victors and the people who are powerful, right? It should be of everybody who existed at any time.
Sure.
And when people say, well, yeah, slavery was long ago, it's like, and first of all, if it's so long ago and it doesn't affect the present, why are you so afraid of us telling you about it? Right? Now, when Governor DeSantis of Florida said that the AP African American Studies course lacked educational value, it was a course created by African American writers and African American scholars. So he was illustrating another rule of whiteness, which is white knowledge is always valid, objective, true, and official. So his pronouncement that lacked the educational value is valid, objective, true, and official. Black knowledge is always invalid, subjective, false or suspicious, and unofficial unless white people decree it. So his very pronouncement, that this course is not educational, is an example of systemic racism, is an example of the way that white knowledge is considered superior to black knowledge. Because DeSantis doesn't have a degree in African American studies. He's not an African American writer. Now, when we say history is not relevant, when the Africans were brought here and enslaved, what did the white slavers owners do? They say, you can't speak your language. You can't talk about your culture. You can't talk about your history. So that is exactly what DeSantis is doing. It's in the tradition of the white slave owner. And yet we're so blind to our history that we can't recognize this. Now, curiously, even though white knowledge is always deemed superior, at every racial point of controversy in our American history, the majority of black people had it right, and the majority of white people had it wrong.
Right.
Whether it's about slavery, Reconstruction and Jim Crow, the civil rights laws. Okay, so black knowledge is essential to understanding our country, and white people think that it's a threat. It's not. It's a gift to the country. Now, when people say Jefferson was so far in the past, well, we have huge racial health disparities. For instance, black people receive less pain medication and wait longer for pain medication than white patients for the exact same conditions. Now, they did a study in 2016, which was cited by Linda Villarosa in her book, Under the Skin, which is a study of racial disparities. And they questioned 222 white medical students. And half of them professed some sort of belief that black people feel less physical pain than white people, often because they believe that black people have thicker skin, which is such an ironic, belief,
Right.
right? Now, Jefferson was a leading proponent of slavery of his time. He was a great writer, and he used his eloquence to write about how black people were intellectually inferior, morally inferior, spiritually inferior, and that they were suited to slavery in part because they felt less physical pain than white people. So this idea that Jefferson was writing about in the late 1700s and early 1800s is there in half of these 222 white medical students in the year 2016. So you can't, and it affects something like that affects how pain medication is administered to black patients. So you can't tell me, the past is way in the past. It's there infecting the minds of half of these white medical students, whom I'm sure, if you ask them, are you racist? They would go, no, I'm not racist.
Right.
They don't even understand that the belief that they have is a racist belief.
Right. Yeah, definitely. I think that you've made a great case both, today and in the book on why we need the whole history taught in schools and not just, like you said, not just the stories whiteness tells itself. But so before we go, David, you already mentioned the Innocent Classroom program that trains K-12 educators to improve their relationships with students of color. Can we close today by you expand a little bit more on the Innocent Classroom and how listeners can find out more? Because I know you said it's, globally it's in a lot of schools, but I would like listeners to know.
So you can look it up at theinnocentclassroom.com. It's on the web. So just plug in Innocent Classroom into your search engine, you'll find it. Now, the way the program starts is we ask teachers, what does America say about children of color? And sometimes you have to prod them a little, to be honest. But then we get things like angry, dropout, gangbanger, violent, stupid, sassy, ugly, undocumented, illegal, strange, loud. And we get this list, and it's like 40 to 50 things, and it's an appalling list. And we tell the teachers, if you know this list, the children know this list. What's more, a good portion of them are thinking you're viewing them through this list, and they don't trust you. And your job is to earn their trust. And you have to create an environment where none of these negative stereotypes are present, where they are not affected by these stereotypes, where their innocence is assumed because these are children, right? And this would seem obvious that these are innocent children. But as we know, there's so many ways in which black children are considered adults in ways that white children are not.
Correct.
And certainly we understand that they're seen through the scrim of these negative stereotypes. And we ask the teachers to find these children's good. And we define good not as good versus bad, but the way Aristotle defined it, which is that for which all things are done. That for which all things are done. And it's sort of like motivation. It's what the child craves. It's the way the child relates to the world. Now, we all have many goods, but children particularly often have just one. And we give them a list of things like smart, respected, leader, belonging, safe, stable, normal. And we say, when you find the good of each child and begin to reinforce that and give them opportunities to act out of their good, the child will recognize you see me as an individual. And then you can have an authentic relationship to them. And once you establish the authentic relationship, then they can learn from you because they trust you. And until then, you have to earn, oftentimes, their trust. But in order to understand the good, you have to see each child as an individual. So if a child needs stability, you have to understand, oh, this child was moved 8 times in the last 2 years, right? Or if they need safety, they have been near trauma, or they have suffered trauma themselves, right? But some of this is so easy. It's like leadership. Teacher it was a high school teacher. 3 kids in the back of the room were giving her trouble. She looked at the group, figured out which one was the leader, brought him out in the hall and said, you know, I'm having a lot of trouble with your 2 friends, and I notice they follow you. They really respect you. You're a leader. Could you help me with them? And then the kid went back and led the kids in a good way, right? I mean, so many kids have so many potentials, but they're all filtered oftentimes through this scrim of these negative stereotypes, which children of color often think, this is what America expects me to be. You know, after George Floyd was killed, there was a letter from a teacher in the north side of Minneapolis who had a 95% black class. And she had asked the class, and I talk about this in my book, The Stories Whiteness Tells Itself, about how she had asked the class to write about My America. And she said 100% of the kids wrote about police harassment. 100% of these black 7th graders, their definition of America was, I, as a black child, experienced police harassment, and that's America to me. And what does that police harassment tell me? You're guilty. You're a potential criminal. And we will always look at you like that. And so what we tell the teachers is, there's powerful messages outside your classroom that you have to work to combat against and create the space of innocence. And so when a child does something wrong in the innocent classroom, we're not talking about punishment. We're talking, what does this child need? What is this child's good? Does this child need stability? Does this child need connection? Does this child need to feel belong? And how can we provide that? Because the child is in a crisis, right? We're not talking about how bad the child is. It changes the whole conversation. Because these kids, as we say, they know how to get thrown out. Some of them, they know how to get thrown out of the classroom. Mm-hmm. But if you refuse to believe the narratives that they're enacting, if you say, no, I don't see you as, I don't judge you through your behavior. I know you're something other than the way you're behaving, right? I know you're good. And I mean that both in the sense of, you want to be a leader. You just did not lead in the way you should be leading. Or I know you're innocent, right? It changes the energy between you and the child.
Sure.
And, and when they say, let's not talk about this, in one class at a school I was working at, we don't recommend this at all, but one teacher asked his 5th grade class, what does America think about kids of color? The class came up with the same list. And this class of 5th graders, just held their own discussion for 45 minutes. Teacher said, I didn't have to guide it. They just discussed this list for 45 minutes. And then at the end, at a certain point, one of the kids says, so what's the antidote to this list? Another kid said, education.
Yeah.
And another kid said, yeah, but we're screwing around. Aren't we screwing with the antidote? It's telling kids know what the world is. And if you gaslight them about the existence of racism, if you gaslight them about our history, they know you're not telling the truth. And this is the only way they're going to recover their innocence, right? Which America tries to rob from them. And the program works.
Sure.
We had in Omaha, this guy he said, I'm a 50-year-old white math teacher with a crew cut. How am I supposed to relate to these adolescent black kids? But he went along with the program reluctantly and began to do some things. Near the end of the program, his principal came to him and said, you used to send the most kids of anyone in the school to my office. In the last 2 months, you haven't sent anybody. What's going on? And of course, he felt much better about himself. He felt much better because he was reaching the kids. And he was understanding, no, I, as a 50-year-old white math teacher with a crew cut, I can reach these kids, right?
Right.
And so it's not only the kids were behaving better, which obviously improves education, But he was feeling greater satisfaction for his job, and he was feeling better about himself. So it's a win-win situation, this program.
No, absolutely. And I'm going to put a link to the Innocent Classroom on the episode page today, along with a link to The Stories Whiteness Tells Itself, Racial Myths, and Our American Narratives. David, thank you so much for joining us on Anchored in Education today.
Thank you so much for having me, Scott.
Now, you can read more about David on today's episode page. Simply head over to my website, escottengland.com, and click on the podcast tab at top. You will also find links to David on social media, as well as a link to the book, The Stories Whiteness Tells Itself. And if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe to Anchored in Education on whatever platform you get your podcasts. And if you'd like to rate it and like it and comment on it and share it with friends, hey, I'd appreciate that too. Just like David's book, this conversation wasn't sugar-coated. I think back often to a conversation I had long ago with Megan Fucciarelli on implicit and explicit bias. It is astounding what our unconscious thinking often tells us. Reading The Stories Whiteness Tells Itself can make one think, oh, I never think like that, or I'm sure that happens, but not near as frequently as one would think. To which I would have to challenge that line of thinking. We cannot begin making clear differences until we acknowledge that to be part of the solution, we have to recognize where we are in the problem. I think it's great if you can say that you aren't racist or don't show racist tendencies, but if that's where it stops, then how are you helping change the narrative? Working in predominantly white communities and then coming to work at a historically black university has given me the opportunity to greatly expand my knowledge, focus, and areas in which I can work to help fight systemic racism. I am by no means an expert in the field, nor am I claiming to work myself to becoming the expert. But informing myself is one way in which I can better position myself to help shift the narratives. I also recommend checking out the podcast The Outsider Within, a podcast for outside voices in critical spaces. One of the co-hosts is a colleague of mine, Dr. Kayla Bureau-Craft. They have had amazing conversations with some amazing people, many of which cross over into the topic we had today. Preparing others and ourselves to be a better version of ourselves today than we were yesterday is just one more reason to remain anchored in education.